Hi folks, on Monday we did some work on tree diagrams. For those of you that weren't in, a tree diagram is a way to represent like a situation. So the situation I'm going to talk about is flipping two coins. Now so far you've only been taught to show this using something called a sample space diagram, which is just a diagram that shows you all the different options. So if you flip two coins you could get heads heads, heads then tails, tails then heads, and tails then tails. So what's all these four things are all the possible outcomes. What's the probability of both coins being tails? 1 out of 1, 2, 3, 4 options. Now all a tree diagram is a different way of representing this. A tree diagram shows you two events. So the first event is the first coin. I could get heads or tails, they're the outcomes of my first event. The second event is flipping the second coin, and the outcomes of that are also heads and tails. And all this diagram shows is the different pathways for the different outcomes. So for instance, if I went along this pathway, the outcome would be heads, heads. If I went along this pathway, the outcome would be heads, tails. If I went along this pathway, the outcome would be tails, heads. And if I went along this pathway, the outcome would be tails, tails. It shows us all the different possible outcomes. But the other thing it does is show us the probabilities, because what we would do is on each branch, we would write the probabilities of getting these outcomes. So when I flip a coin, the probability of getting heads is a half, the probability of getting tails is a half. Now obviously these situations get a little bit more complicated, that's what we'll go through today. If you did the Hegarty Maths clip that I set on Monday, you should recognise this. But the way we use a tree diagram is we talk about each pathway. So the pathway I said from these ones was heads, heads. And what we do then is we multiply those probabilities. When you multiply fractions, you need to remember how to do that. We multiply the numerators, multiply the denominators, we get a quarter. So the probability of getting heads, heads is a quarter. For the next pathway, we have the probability of heads then tails. That's a half times a half, because we just multiply along that pathway. We multiply those probabilities, and we get a quarter. And so on. So we get the probabilities of each of the four outcomes. Heads, 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 tails, tails, heads, and tails, tails. Now the tree diagrams we're going to do today are a bit more complicated than this. What you might want to do on the next question is pause it and have a go yourself, especially if you were in on Monday, and if you did the Hegarty, you'll be able to give that a try. If you don't recognise this, watch the first one and how I do it, and then maybe try the second one instead. So here's the first question I'd like us to look at. Now if you notice, it's the same one that I've already done. It's flipping a coin twice. But what I want to show you is the different ways that you could do this. So look at the difference. One of the differences is that they've given the probabilities as decimals. That's fine, you're allowed to do that. Probabilities can be written as decimals, percentages, or fractions. They must not be written as a ratio. But we've got all these probabilities, and I showed you that on the previous page. Now let's look at the questions. So the first one, A, says find the probability of getting two heads. So follow the pathway that's heads, heads, that's down here. So the probability of getting that is 0.25. And remember, pause the video and have a go if you want before I go through this. Next one says find the probability of getting a head, then a tail. So it has to be that order. So we're going head, then tail. We're following that pathway. That pathway gave me that outcome. So this one is 0.25 again. But the next question says find the probability of getting at least one head. Well, that means I could have this pathway, because two heads is at least one head. I could have this second pathway because that's one head, and I could have this pathway. So it means I could have all three of these. And I haven't taught you yet, what do you do when there's more than one pathway that answers your question? Well, all you do then is you add them together. And that's generally all tree diagram questions will ever do. They will expect you to work out the probabilities on the tree diagram, then they will ask you questions about the pathways. Sometimes they'll just ask for one pathway, sometimes it might be more. Next question we're going to try is this one. Pause the video and have a go at working out the probabilities for each pathway. These are the answers you should have got. Now, it's one thing to notice that I haven't mentioned yet. In each branch, so here's a branch, these probabilities have to add up to 1. 0.6 and 0.4 is 1. 0.7 and 0.3 is 1. Same there, so each branch has to add up to 1. Okay, going back to the question. Let's try and answer A. What's the probability of both boys missing? That's this pathway here, and that's 0.12. What's the probability of one boy scoring? So that's just one. So that means this pathway and this pathway. What did we say we did when there were two options? So for this question, we can have one boy scoring. Is one pathway gives us 0.18 and the other pathway gives us 0.28. So all we do is we add those together. 0.46 for B. And then the final one, the probability of at least one boy missing. So that means this one, because it's at least one. So it could be both. So it's all three of them. So that answer would be 0.58. So, could remember, one is that the branches add to 1. Also, when you go along pathways, you multiply. And if the thing they're asking you about, if there's more than one pathway, you add those probabilities up. But remember, that's the final probabilities that you're adding. The ones at the end of the tree, not the ones here. You will never add them. You multiply along the pathways. There is Hegarty Clip 361 if you're struggling with this. All I'm going to do now is show you 4 more questions for you to have a go at. Pause the video and try this question now. Here's the answers. Mark your work. Here's another question. Pause the video, have a go at this question now. Here's your answers. Mark your work. Remember, if you are struggling with this, Hegarty Clip 361 might help. Here's the final question. Pause the video and have a go now. They're the probabilities that should be on your tree diagram. Now, there's no space to do them at the end of the branches, so I'm going to do them along the bottom. Here's your different possibilities. So they're the probabilities that should be at the end of your tree diagram. And if you look at these bits, that'll tell you which pathways you were looking at. So the probability of 2 lemon sweets, 25 over 81. The probability of 1 of each flavour, that's your 2081s, add your 2081s, which is 40 81s. And the probability that we get no lemon sweets. Well, if we haven't got any lemon sweets, we must have 2 strawberry sweets. Oh, didn't write that answer in, sorry. So that's going to be 16 out of 81. Okay, so that's tree diagrams, and that's pretty much the hardest it will get on your paper. This is grade 4 and 5. It didn't used to be on foundation. It moved down from higher onto foundation. But once you've got the hang of it, you will be able to do it. If you want more practice and you haven't done it yet, Hegarty Maths 361 can provide you with a bit more practice. But do make sure you write the work down in your book. Well done, folks. That's all for today.